In this video, we're going to be talking about the process of formulating messages. Now, presumably, we speak because we want to communicate some idea or some message that's in our heads to someone else using language. But what does that message or that idea look like? It can't just be a vague thought or a mental image. Specific decisions have to be made about the conceptual content that that message is going to contain. But the chunks of thought that come right before language are really hard to examine. They're so far hidden from our view that you really can't even examine them yourself most of the time. Just to think about what thought appears to be in the absence of language is almost incomprehensible to us. Our thinking and our language are so intimately tied together that it's almost impossible to think what our pre-verbal thoughts feel like or experience like. Consider this image, for instance. Language doesn't allow you to just transmit this image to someone else. You can't mentally beam this picture into someone's mind. You have to describe it. So language forces you to choose the details that you're going to describe. Do you want to convey that the human in this scene is a person, a man, a hunter? Do you want to specify that he's terrified or that he's wearing a brown jacket or blue pants? Do you care to point out that the lion is large, ferocious, or that he has a flowing mane? And how do you want to characterize what's happening between the lion and the man? Who's the subject of your description? Are you going to focus on the lion or the man? Is the lion threatening the man, or is the man shooting the lion? I mean, both of those are true, but what are you going to focus on if you're describing this scene? Is the man defending himself from the lion? Research has shown that when you start to talk about this scene, you won't necessarily have planned out the entire sentence when you start talking. But what about the thoughts themselves? When you start talking, have you already experienced all the pre-verbal thoughts that you're going to try and express in words? Or are the thoughts still being thunk while you're speaking the words? Do you know what I mean? I'm going to show you a few studies that will help us to see what's going on with the interaction between the thinking and the speaking. Now, if we were just reading the entire textbook in order, you'd have already learned by now that every sentence in every language needs to include a subject, verb, and object. That's the bare minimum. Subject, verb, and object. You can also add adjectives and adverbs and prepositions and articles and stuff like that, but those are all optional parts. You always have to have a subject, verb, and object. They don't always come in the same order. Like English is known as an SVO language because that's the order we use to structure our sentences, but some languages will put like the verb first and then the subject and object. Really, every combination is possible, but SVO and SOV are the most common. So let me give you some examples of sentences in English so that you can see what I mean by subject, verb, object. So one example is girls are smart. Girls is the subject, are is the verb, smart is the object. It's the description of what the girls are. Hunters kill lions. The man went to the store. You can see in this one I threw in a couple of articles like the and to. But the point is still the same, that we've got a subject, the man, and a verb is what he's doing, he's going, he went to, and the object is where he went, the store. I had to take a minute just here and explain that because this concept of subjects and objects is going to play into some of the research that's coming up here that I'm going to describe in a minute. So all of the studies that we're going to be mentioning in this part of the textbook use eye tracking And the reason for this is because researchers have found that eye movements can show them what people are thinking. They kind of betray your pre-verbal thoughts. And I don't know that I should say it tells you what they're thinking, but like if your eyes are focused on certain aspects of a picture or a scene, they know kind of like what's being processed mentally. So here's an example apparatus that is used to track the eye movements. And here's some examples of what the output looks like. If you're looking at a particular website, you can show that output as a heat map, like reflecting red where they spend the most time looking, and green where they spend some time looking but less time. And then you can see that where there's no color, there's really no looking at all. Another way is to look at a gaze plot, which represents the order in which things are looked at and how long they're looked at while the eyes are focused on that location. So the size of the circle, if it's relatively large, indicates how long they spent looking there, and the order is indicated by the numbers on each circle. So this is the second place that the eyes jumped to, and then, you know, of course the lines illustrate where they went after that. So it might go like from 2 to 3 to 4. Hard for me to see 5. I think it's hidden somewhere back here. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Anyway, the point is, where your eyes are moving are indicated on this gaze plot. So researchers can see where your eyes are looking and make inferences about what kinds of thoughts you might be having based on how long you're staring and the order in which you looked at things on the screen. So in one study, researchers showed scenes like these to participants and asked them to describe what was going on. They wanted to know if the participants in the study would analyze the whole scene before they started talking about it, or if they'd begin describing the first thing in the picture that seemed to catch their attention and just keep describing and looking as they went along. So the researchers set up 3 different conditions. The first condition was something like they needed to prepare to describe the scene, and the researcher said, when you're ready to talk, push the button and the scene will disappear. And then after the scene disappeared, then they would have to explain what they saw. So like in the case of panel A, they might say like, the boy in red kicked the boy with a hat, or something like that. In condition number 2, they were to describe the scene that they're looking at, and the scene was just there in front of them the entire time, and it didn't vanish. And then the third condition said, the researchers told them, identify the victim in the scene, and press a button when you're ready to answer the question. So this task forced the participants in all 3 conditions to analyze the scene and make a decision about who was doing what to whom, who the actors were, and what their relationship was. In the first 2 conditions, the participants had to speak a full sentence, but in the third, they didn't have to prepare one. So that was the control condition. They were just saying who the victim was. In that condition, people would glance at the scene for half a second, and their eyes would then settle on the victim, and then they'd push the button and answer the question. Now, in the first condition, where they knew that the picture was going to disappear, the participants also scanned the whole scene, and also within a half a second, their eyes landed on the person that they were going to make the subject of the sentence, and that could be either the aggressor or the victim. But since it also took them a half second for the people's eyes to settle on the victim in that third condition, we can surmise that the only thing that was going on in that half second in the first condition was that they were taking the scene and settling on a conceptualization of the relationship between the characters. And the reason why we can surmise that is because the same exact amount of time means that the same exact amount of thought happened. And since the only thing they had to do in the third condition was to think about the relationship between the two people and conceptualize the scene, but not to actually plan any verbal response, then the same half a second in the first condition was just that same thing, just looking at the scene, conceptualizing what's going on, and understanding the relationship between the two people. Now, the interesting one was the second condition, where people were allowed to keep looking at the scene while they described it. Those people also scanned the scene, their eyes landing on the subject of the sentence in the same half second as everybody else. And that's when they began talking. They'd try first to name the subject of the sentence, and then their eyes would swivel over to the other character, and the rest of the sentence would come out, and that character would eventually be named as the object of the sentence. But in this condition, their eyes would rest on the character for about a full second before they'd name the character. Both characters, really. And since it takes a full second, just like if you're doing a picture naming task, to just come up with the name of a picture, it takes a full second. So since they were staring at both of these actors for a full second, the researchers realized that that second, what was going on was the participants were extracting the name of the character, like a label for the character, for a full second. That's what was going on in that second. So the participants were first formulating a conceptual plan that involved both characters and how they were related to each other, like what they were doing, and then figured out which character would be the subject of the sentence, and only then began to retrieve from their memory the word that represented the main character. So the first half a second is understand the scene. The second half a second is like I'm staring at this character that I'm going to make the subject of my sentence, and they begin speaking, and while they're speaking, they're pulling this name of the not the name of the person, but like the title, the descriptor of the person. They're pulling that out of memory, and then they keep speaking something about the sentence. They're saying like the girl in pink, that's the subject, is spraying. See, that's the verb part. The girl in blue or green with the hose. Something like that, okay? But what's going on here is a well-organized message was taking place, like the plan was taking place before the process of word retrieval began. So this study shows that the understanding of the scene occurs before the speech begins, but then the speech is kind of unfolding while the participant is searching for the words from memory. But other research shows that the stages of language production are not always this orderly. Sometimes the process of trying to plan the message and trying to retrieve the words overlap. So I just described how if you're pulling the information from your memory, that's retrieving the words, and that happens after the message has already been planned, like you've already understood the scene. But sometimes those two things are happening simultaneously. Sometimes you haven't actually understood the whole scene before you start talking. So suppose your attention is heavily focused on a particular thing you want to talk about. The name of that thing might pop into your head before you decide exactly what you want to say about it, so that linguistic planning intrudes into the message planning stage. So remember, we've got these two stages. The message planning is like the idea formation, like just understanding pre-verbally, understanding conceptually what's going on. And if sometimes like a word pops into your head, then that will intrude on that thought formation stage with the language part. So in this study that's on this slide, participants first stared at a cross in this on the computer screen. They stared at a cross, and then a black box would be flashed on the screen so fast that the participants weren't even consciously aware that they saw it. And yet, that little black box drew their eyes toward the box. So they're first looking in the center of the screen right here, and their eyes flash here very quickly towards the black box. But before they even recognize that there is a black box, the scene pops on the computer screen. So putting the black box in this area where one of the two actors is going to be placed changed the participants' processing of the scene. Instead of gazing at the whole thing for half a second and eventually landing on one of the characters as the subject of the sentence, the eyes of the participants in this study immediately locked on the actor, like in this case the dog, where the black box had been. And they just stared at it for a full second until the name of that character or that actor came into their head. So this forced that character to be the subject of the sentence, so that if the black box were, like in this image, the person would say, "The dog is chasing the man." They would have to form the sentence that way because with the black box being located where it was, their eyes were forced onto the dog, and the word dog was retrieved out of their memory, and as that process began, then they started speaking, and before they had even formulated what was going on in this scene, they started saying something about the dog, and then that had to be the sentence. That had to be the subject of the sentence. The dog is chasing the man. But if instead the black box had been located somewhere like over here, where the man was going to be, then the sentence would have ended up being the man is running away from the dog instead, because the man would be the subject of the sentence. So what's going on here? If attention is strongly focused on one actor in the scene that you're trying to describe, you're likely to retrieve its corresponding lemma, or word or idea, concept, before the message planning is complete. So that idea is going to, like that word, man or dog, that's going to come out of your memory before you've even planned what you want to say about the scene, before your idea is formed. And once that lemma is retrieved, then the participant has to decide and go ahead and utter that word even before the idea is formulated, while they're still working out the conceptualization of this event. And so this commits the participant to using a certain word order, which may in turn influence the content of the message plan or the idea that they're trying to formulate. So in this view of message planning, it's like controlled chaos. The message plan, the idea, has to be coordinated with the linguistic planning. And if the linguistic planning accidentally gets ahead of itself, where you like start talking before you know exactly what you're going to say, the message may need to be adjusted. You probably have had this experience. I guarantee you've had this experience. I've had this experience while recording this very lecture right now. You might remember having an experience in which, like, you started a sentence and then had to kind of find a way of making the grammar a little convoluted in order to finish the sentence. Or you might have like messed up the sentence so bad that you just stopped that one and started over and tried to like recreate a new sentence that made better sense. Or backtracked a few words and kind of fixed the grammar of something where, like what I've just done, like where you interrupt yourself and then you kind of go back and fix something you just said and try again. This study right here is illustrating why that happens. Sometimes one word pops into your mind, like in this case it would have been like the word dog, pops into your mind, and you need to get it out of the way so you can work it into the sentence early on, but then once you've worked that into the sentence as the subject of the sentence, that alters the structure of the rest of your sentence. You might also have had trouble speaking at times, not because it was hard to retrieve a word, but because you were having trouble organizing your thoughts. Like maybe the idea you were trying to express was especially complex or something. This suggests that not all messages are equally easy to plan. So what happens with those that are like really hard to plan? Similar to what I just described, in a follow-up study to the one I showed you earlier, researchers used more ambiguous scenes like these, where it wasn't exactly clear what was going on. Like in A and B, you can see it's clear that one person is doing something to the other. But in C and D, it's not so obvious. If you were to describe these scenes, and I were to describe them, and your roommate were to have a go, we'd all end up with different interpretations of what's going on between, like, this construction worker and policeman, or this cat and dog. So what happens when we track the eye gaze for these kinds of pictures? Well, the researchers of this study wanted to know whether they would look at, like whether participants would look at both of the figures for a longer period of time to try and figure out what was going on, or if, like we saw in the last study, if they would just quickly settle on one of the actors and just start talking and then figure out what was going on as they talked. And that's what they ended up doing. Within a few hundred milliseconds, they had decided that the message would take some time to form. And so they might as well just begin the task of naming the first character while they plan what the idea is and what language they're going to use to describe this sentence. So this means that speakers are actually starting their formation, making a leap of faith that the message will take shape quickly enough for them to actually continue speaking smoothly. Of course, as I mentioned on the last slide, things don't always work out that way. Sometimes you have to backtrack and, correct what you've said, but you can't just sit and plan out everything you want to say before you start talking. Like, the people that you're talking with in ordinary conversations won't be patient for that. People are often interrupting each other, and people respond to each other incredibly fast. So, even getting your part into a conversation can be a bit of a competition sometimes. If you want to say something complicated, you have to do what this study found and just start talking and hope that you can find a way to finish working out the details of your thinking and kind of what it is you want to convey, and then hope that the words will kind of come along as you go as well, so that you're crafting your thoughts and the sentence as you go, and it's just kind of all working itself out. One more study illustrates how these disfluencies that I've been talking about, or these kind of speech corrections, these interruptions, these stuff like that, how these occur in real life. So participants in this study were told to look at a scene like this and give instructions to a partner who was also in this study. They were supposed to say something like, click on the fish tank and move it to underneath the windmill. But some of the pictures had a contrasting object that made it ambiguous or uncertain which object their partner, their conversation partner, was supposed to click. Like in this picture, there are two horses, and maybe the person wasn't, the participant in the study was supposed to tell their conversation partner to click on the small horse here, but it would depend on whether they'd already seen that horse. So whether they'd seen both horses. So the researchers tracked their eye gaze of the participants to see if they happened to see both horses before they started talking. And if they did, then they'd say, click on the small horse. But if they started talking first and then noticed that there were two horses and there was some ambiguity here, then they'd have to backtrack. So they'd say something like, click on the horse, the small one. Sometimes they'd get it right the first time, but there would be a pause, as they realized in the middle of what they were doing that there was two horses. So they would say, click on the small horse, or click on the small horse. And that pause reflected that, just in that exact moment, they were realizing that there was ambiguity, and they were correcting their sentence accordingly. So, as you can see, disfluencies, interjections, corrections, backtracking, ums, uhs, pauses, all these kinds of things are part of the natural flow of conversation. they're crazy prevalent, and problematically, you've probably noticed a lot of that going on in my lecture today. And I always have these kinds of interjections, disfluencies. Everybody does, right? It's just part of the natural flow of conversation. But you usually only notice them if they're at like a much higher than usual rate. In fact, these disfluencies can actually help comprehension in some situations, rather than just posing problems for your for your listener. Sometimes it can actually facilitate understanding if if they're used in certain ways. And so in your next reading, you're going to read about that and how that can happen. And hopefully that will give you a greater appreciation for and more patience with ums and uhs and interjections and disfluencies and interjections and corrections and backtracking and all that kind of stuff in the future, as you listen to ordinary live conversations.